What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Average People Talking Show. I guess I should say welcome back to myself. It has been a minute. It has been a hot minute since the show last aired. And we have had a lot of things happen lately. I'm just kind of getting started here and, sharing some stuff on some social media. I'm getting started a little late just because I had some technical difficulties and my kids were having a hard time deciding who wanted to stay, who wanted to go with the holiday tomorrow, and that kind of thing. But looking forward to having a great conversation tonight. If you guys aren't in my Discord, that is the place where I post the vast majority of updates about the show and kind of what my thinking has been about it going forward. And my motivation to do new episodes has kind of been up and down lately. I haven't really... Oh, hey, new share. Look at that. I bet it's me, because I'm the one who did it. I've been having a hard time. I don't know why exactly I haven't had the motivation to talk about new topics. I think it's because lately I have found myself to be wholly unconvincing on some things that I think are really important. And that's bothered me. And I think I've let it kind of get into my head. It's also been a little bit my personal life and passion hasn't been there. I've been incredibly focused on work and trying to do a great job there, my own relationships. There's just been a lot lately. And it's been hard to find time to do this. It's been hard to commit to it. And more than that, I haven't felt like I had something that I really wanted to say. So all of that has played a pretty big role in my disappearance, my lack of commitment to this. That's all a really big challenge for me. And I don't really know the best way to navigate it. But I did have something that happened in my life this past week and really happened in all of our lives this past week that made me realize I wanted to talk about some really key issues, some really important things that I think we're all kind of thinking and talking about. So I want to set the stage for what that is tonight. For starters, I've had some personal friends and relationship things that have gone on, and at times I'm really confident in a lot of the things I talk about, especially on this show. I wouldn't do it if I wasn't really sure that I was onto something with a lot of the things that I talk about. A big part of being on the show is if I have a topic or a discussion that I think warrants getting to this point, I've probably thought about it quite a lot, and I've probably gotten into, the nitty-gritty details of it quite a bit. And so I don't come here unless I'm confident in talking about something. But in my personal life, sometimes I don't know where that boundary is, and I get overzealous. I want to talk about these issues in a more serious way. Hi, Micah. Thanks for joining. Let's be honest. I talk about some really controversial stuff. I talk about some stuff that is really on the leading edge of what most people are even comfortable thinking about, let alone discussing. And I've been thinking about, why is that? Why is it that some of these things are so uncomfortable? And what's different in my life looking back? What changed for me? And then, more so beyond the personal, over the last couple weeks, the abortion debate has raged very very hotly. And there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out what to believe, what to think, what's true about that. Obviously, we know the catalyst to that was the revelation that it looks like the Supreme Court is prepared to overturn Roe versus Wade. And people are talking about some things that they don't normally talk about. They're talking about things in ways that they don't normally talk about. And I see online it turns into nasty, nasty stuff. And people just tearing each other down, painting the other person as a monster. Really, really saying some evil things. So again, the reason why, if you watch this show ever, you really want to come join my Discord, which you can find in my link tree. That's where I post a lot of these messages and a lot of these updates about the show. We have a general chat and some different chat channels, so I encourage you to come check it out there. But I just wanted to read kind of my message on there to kick off the show here, as I think it sets the stage. Hey, APT fans and supporters. I've been quite busy, and it's been a long time since I've streamed. My thinking lately has been deep and wide, and I've had a lot of great life experiences over the past couple months that have helped me realize some things I need to work on personally, professionally, and in my relationships. And part of that process, I've also realized that often my arguments come across as abrasive and too strong to many people, and that caused me to reflect on why that is. Why is it I have this problem with other people who seem more closed-minded than me? Why do some people say they are open-minded but don't seem to actually be? Why do some people hold certain viewpoints as sacred? In the past 2 months in the world of politics, no two issues have highlighted this more than the abortion debate and the gun debate, both raging again after major events that have brought attention back to these core issues. It's clear to me that 99% of all dialogue and communication about these topics is happening far away from the core disagreements people actually have on the issues. Many people refuse to budge on certain points because they're not intellectually honest or consistent. Further, the amount of bad faith on both sides of these heavily contested issues is astounding. Both sides painting the other as evil, uncaring, unfeeling monsters who don't value the basic right to human life. I know why, and I think that's what tonight's Overdue stream will be about. I'm going to talk about the concepts of arguments, academic versus arguments personal. I'm going to talk about why there's nothing I won't be open to changing my mind about. I'm going to talk about the problem of toxic discourse and social media. I'm going to bundle all these concepts into an easy breakdown of the human mind and why we are so capable of getting things wrong. I think this might be one of the most important and timely episodes, and even though it's short notice, I hope you will rally some friends and join me live, and if not, as always, the full episodes will go live to my YouTube channel. So that was kind of the message that I put out there, and I decided this, honestly, fairly late today. But it was triggered in a conversation with my lovely wife, Micah, where we were talking about issues where, there are things that, for example, she told me she would never ever change her mind on, that she has since changed her mind on. The death penalty was one of them. Different things like that. That people really hold close to the vest, really hold sacred. And then I get on here, and if you go back through my videos section of my YouTube, which is where all the full episodes go, right, you will find out that there's no shortage of topics that I won't push the absolute edge on or challenge really basic common beliefs that people have. Monogamy being one of them. Free will being another one. Religion. The belief in the supernatural generally. I'm trying to think of some other major topics that we've covered in the past. Whether America is a force for good in the world or not. I've certainly questioned that from time to time. These are some things that people hold really, really dear, and they hold in very high esteem and value. And then I challenge them, and that really, really makes people unsettled from time to time. But I think I know why. And I think I know why this is so difficult in these times where people have some really not nice words to say to each other, especially online. And of course, online makes it a lot easier to be nasty to each other. So let's start off with the first thing. Many people will say, I'll never change my mind about blank. You'll never change my mind about private property. You'll never change my mind about guns. You'll never change my mind about abortion. It's murder. It's wrong. You'll never change my mind about it. Well, right there is where my thinking and most people's thinking splits. I don't have a single belief that I would say I'll never change my mind about. There's not one. I'm supremely confident that there is evidence and things that could come to light that could change my mind about anything if I'm thinking rationally and trying to view it in the right way. So that becomes difficult for people. Part of the reason why I think is we feel like there are certain things that are core to our values, and we want to stay true to our values. We use that expression. I'll never change my mind on this. That's just me staying true to my values. Okay. Let's examine the sentence that you just stated. Staying true. So what does true mean? If staying true to your values is important to you, truth itself is a value, right? We apply a certain truth value to claims and facts, right? The things that have the highest truth value we call facts or objective truth. Truth that exists independent of human opinion. And that truth value is more important than all your other values because it's the one that all your other values are checked against. But we've got to be able to understand how we actually get something true. How is the sauce made? How do we figure out what makes something objectively true? One of the things, and this is probably the first controversial thing I'll say tonight, don't run away from the stream. If you're here, please say hi in chat. I'd love to talk to you and have this more of a discussion back and forth with the audience. You can do so on Twitch or YouTube. But, I don't think there's any such thing as my truth. There are subjective truths. And I think one great example of this is colors. There used to be a strong case for the argument of color realism, right? And we can find scientific evidence for certain colors. But it's clear that when most of us say a color and what we think that color is, whether it be red, purple, fuchsia, peach, or orange, we are just stating what it seems like subjectively to us. And I'm fairly certain that my peach could be your orange. And it would be, as of right now, impossible to figure out if there's a true answer to what is the color peach. That's a purely subjective kind of claim. And I just want to plant a flag there because that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about things that you experience that are purely subjective. Like vanilla tastes sweet. Well, maybe to some people, vanilla tastes not sweet. Maybe that's not how they are playing a language game. They think sweet is a different type of sensation. Maybe vanilla is just not sweet to them. In the case of tastes and preferences and sensory input, those things are purely subjective, and we're really just dancing around what we want to call things or how we experiencing things. Ultimately, I like vanilla, I don't like vanilla. It's not sweet, but I still like it. It is sweet, but I don't like it. It's too sweet. Whatever it is, that's purely subjective. When we're talking about an objective truth, we're appealing to something outside of ourselves. We're appealing to the thing that is important so that we can together agree upon a shared view of reality, right? Something that anchors your experience and mine to the real world outside, independent of ourselves. The things we share. And as a result, a lot of people will say, well, it's true to me. This is my truth. I'm going to say that there's no such thing. And I'm going to make the case for that. Outside of those subjective personal truths, there's a lot of people who take hotly contested social issues. So we brought up abortion in the beginning. Abortion is an issue that very much depends on whether or not you think humans have souls. Okay, well, there is a Hello, Tyler. Welcome. Join us. Thank you. There's a lot of question about that to where people are not willing to budge on the concept of a soul. Like, that's one of those that they say, you can't change my mind. Humans have souls. That's it. That's off limits. Can't change my mind about that. Humans definitely have souls. Okay. But there is a true answer to whether or not there's such a thing as a human soul. Independent, verifiable, objectively true, independent of human opinion. And just because it's difficult to know for sure, just because it's something that a lot of other beliefs dependent on, I'm going to suggest to you that if you actually are thinking critically and being intellectually honest with yourself, you're going to have to even let some of those most sacred beliefs get challenged, including whether or not we have souls. So that's the difference of what we're talking about and what kind of truth we're talking about. So something I've talked about a few times, and if you watch the episode where I read a letter to my parents, I try to anchor conversations that could be potentially incendiary or, have a potential for making people really upset. I try to anchor them to shared values and a shared hierarchy of values. And why do I do this? I do this because it's really important to notice that sharing those values are the only way we're going to agree upon things and come to some kind of conclusion when we disagree with each other. If I don't share values with you, if you don't share my values, we truly have nothing to talk about. Like, what evidence would you give somebody that doesn't value evidence to show them that they should value evidence? What logic can you use to reason with somebody that they should value logic? Obviously, the question answers itself. You can't. You can't do this. And so if you don't share our core values, the things that don't necessarily have an explanation, they're things you have to kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and accept, well then, there's really nothing further to discuss. If you don't value human life, I'm not going to have a discussion about what we could do to better the value of human life with a psychopath. You just don't have a regard for human life. So that kind of makes the conversation pointless. And yet I see many people stay in relationships, stay in conversations, or talk back and forth where they're very far away from the values. So the way I kind of structure my hierarchy of values, I know these three are typically 1, 2, and 3 for virtually everyone that, again, isn't a psychopath or sociopath. And they're the building blocks that we could start any difficult conversation. That number one overall value is truth. If you don't know what's true, well, then you don't have a good grip on reality, and the rest of it doesn't make any sense. I mean, truth-telling game is the thing we have to be engaged in to make sense of the real world around us. We have to understand what's true, what's objectively true, independent of my bias, independent of human opinion. Figuring out what's true and that property of a fact or reality as that corresponds to any claim or declaration or belief that somebody holds, we have to have a method of figuring that out. And everything else depends on it. And I truly mean everything else. I don't think you can do any important work in between two people if we can't have a way that we agree upon what's true. And yet, because this is sometimes difficult, this is what you see people saying is, well, I don't want to talk about that. That's too much for me. You're challenging me too much. This is my truth. Back off of it. You can't touch it. It's not yours. Well, as we're going to examine here in a little bit, that's really not how we ever got truth. One person's opinion is clearly not good enough to get truth. You don't have your truth. There's the truth. And there's a way to find it. So we'll come back to that. What's the next value? I look at it as morality. And I put morality higher than objective well-being, which is the third value, because really well-being is a necessary property of morality. And I think we care more about being moral than our own well-being. In some ways, as human beings, we recognize that living a good life, doing good things, and avoiding doing bad things, I think we recognize that that is something related to well-being. But we would also, personally, I don't think we value our well-being as much as we value morality and truth. One of the common causes of suicide is people that, have lost the plot on knowing how to ground themselves in truth and what's good. I mean, that's part of what a psychotic break is, right? The reason it's called that is because we are losing our grip on reality. And once we lose our grip on reality, it becomes really hard to care about our own well-being. Because it's so core to us, it makes everything not make sense. And if nothing makes sense, I don't know what it means to be well. I don't know what it means to be well. If I can't know what's true, I don't know how to live a good life. I don't know what would even mean a good or bad life. And more than that, I can't understand what would be good or bad for my own well-being or anyone else's. So I have no way of reconciling that. I think in a lot of cases, most people would sacrifice their own well-being for doing good for others. We see this in human nature all the time. There are cases where our own survival does outweigh it in a pinch. But if we have time to stop and think for a moment, I think in the age of our rational brains, we tend to lean more heavily on this concept. Hey, Yikes Factory, life is all right. Things are doing pretty well. I've been very busy. If you join my Discord, you will see that I've been pretty hard to get a hold of lately. But that it's all been good things, and it's all been things that I've been thinking about lately. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So if we understand that truth is the most important value, I want you to take a minute before we get into this next piece and really think about what that means. If I'm going to say that truth is the most important value, and I'm talking, again, objective truth, true that you and I can agree upon, and all my relationships depend on it, my ability to live a good life and experience maximum well-being, my ability to make good choices and live a moral life, if all that depends on what's true, it doesn't make a lot of sense to shut down a conversation that starts to contradict something that you currently think is true. If somebody's got an idea or something that's in contradiction with what you find to be true, and they bring it up, closing the door to that conversation is closing you off to maybe finding out if maybe you're wrong. Maybe you have a false belief. Maybe something you currently think is true is not. And if you truly are going to say that truth is the most important value you hold, and honesty, including that intellectual honesty with yourself, being honest with yourself, is the most important value you hold, then you're going to have to be open to some uncomfortable conversation and some uncomfortable facts and lines of questioning. But what is that process? What is that? Why bother with it? What does it actually mean to be open-minded? Well, I want to suggest that the definition of being open-minded is being open to what's true. Finding that out. And one of the big problems I have with our current education system is we don't learn philosophy typically until college or elective courses late in high school, senior year, something like that. We don't start to think about, maybe we learn a little bit about logic, right? Certainly we learn math. Math is a fundamental building block of logic. But we don't really think about how we get human knowledge. Now, what's interesting about that is the PH and PhD is literally stands for philosophy. You know, the an actual PhD is a doctorate of philosophy, and you can get a doctorate of philosophy in a bunch of interesting, you know, fields. That doctorate of philosophy, like, why put philosophy first? Well, because to truly understand architecture, to truly understand, science, to truly understand psychology, to truly understand, like, you need to understand how to think about that subject. Philosophy is the study of how we know what we know, the building blocks of logic. Socrates started Socratic method and the kind of Socratic discourse that leads to knowledge, where you ask questions continually until either somebody gets to a question that they can't answer, we get to something like at bottom that we don't have a good answer for, and then we go with like the best argument that's on offer, and we go back and forth with this argumentation. And so I said I wanted to make it different. A lot of times people in a modern day context, I'll start to disagree with them. I'll bring up points that I don't think, for whatever reason, they've told me how they're thinking, and their thinking makes no sense to me. I think that it's crazy. I think that it's beyond the pale, whatever they're thinking about. And I'll bring up counterpoints and evidence and challenge their thinking. And this is usually where you get that gut reaction of like, hey, you'll never change my mind on this. This is too sacred. This is too important. Well, the problem with that is, number one, it asserts that you're correct automatically and that you have no room for changing. And again, if you're going to say that you value truth, we already talked about why you should not do that. Understanding that argumentative dialogue is not about this. When two people are questioning things and putting up arguments about a given subject, your interlocutor in a philosophical debate, you actually respect them for asking you tough questions. You want to put your idea up against the best arguments to see if your current line of reasoning holds up. And if it doesn't, then you should throw it out as not true. That's how the Socratic method works, and that's how we both get closer to what's true. If you're out there and you are feeling me on this, or if you've ever experienced this in conversation, it's very easy to do things about things that aren't that critical. We do it all the time, right? Hey, did you know that the Space Shuttle Challenger went around the Earth like 6 times before it came back? Oh, no. You must have the Challenger confused with a different space shuttle. The Challenger is the one that exploded in the atmosphere. Okay, well, it's very easy to settle this argument. We can appeal to an authority. We can pull up Google and look at what, Wikipedia says about the history. We can find out that turns out the Challenger was the one that exploded on live television and did not go around the Earth however many times or whatever, right? There are answers to easy questions that we're very open-minded about normally. When we start getting into actual fundamental philosophical differences between us about rights and things like we're talking about with gun control and abortion and difficult topics, many of which I discuss on this show, it becomes a lot harder. It becomes a lot harder because, again, we've built a lot of beliefs based on our core beliefs. We've put a lot into them. We've got a lot emotionally riding on what we're talking about. And so if it starts to get challenged, it becomes very uncomfortable very quickly. We're like, hey, this is freaking me out. And now I want to address Tyler's question on YouTube here. Is ego not one of the biggest barriers to open-mindedness? Well, yes. In fact, the ego is the number one, right? Anything that I think is a benefit to me, I have a bias towards believing because it's a benefit to me and who I am. And I that my self-image is tied into all of that. So if I have to change my belief on this, let's take, for example, the issue of, I don't know, whether or not you should work for a living or work for your own money, right? Getting a handout, getting a helping hand from somebody else. There's a lot of people, for their ego, they make it part of their identity that, no, I'm the guy who does everything for myself. I don't need any help from the outside. And so if you even suggest to me that other people, I'm going to tell you that other people should also be like me, right? They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get to work because I work hard for everything that I get and I don't take handouts. So they should too. Okay, well, you might have made that part of your identity and you might think that that gives you some kind of moral superiority over other people. But what if that's simply not the case? And what are the conditions with which we could bring up where your argument kind of falls apart? And then you go down that rabbit hole. Another example of ego getting in the way of open-mindedness would be, in general, just you are preoccupied with your own personal goals that you think are a benefit to your well-being and doing the right thing. I would say a lot of the social norms around sexual morality fall into this category. We don't want to accept a power dynamic view of consent as a society, even though that seems to be true. So what do I mean by power dynamic view of consent? I mean, like, what Louis C.K. did was wrong because he had power over the women. So even though he asked in English language terms, for consent, he couldn't really get consent because of the power that he had over them. And our own egos get in the way because if that's true, there's a million ways in which we exercise power over others that we could then be criticized or condemned for. That will reduce our self-esteem. That will reduce our image of ourselves, or maybe we're guilty of that crime at some point in our lives in that more sexual domain. That creates a really complicated problem for people, and so they don't want to accept it. It's much easier to just go with the, hey, if you ask and they say yes, I mean, that's consent. I don't want to start thinking about power dynamics because then I would have to accept maybe even economic power dynamics. Maybe I have too much private property, and that is actually me imposing a duty on everybody else in the society and allowing me to get away with things that those people can't do, and I do have power over them. It becomes uncomfortable for people really quick, so then their ego gets in the way. Tyler, I don't know if you heard all that, but I mean, it's a great question. But I think even underneath of ego, what's really getting in the way is just our ability to confuse ourselves about our values. It becomes easy to have some flawed reasoning. We forget that we need truth to know what's good for us and know what's good to do. And so if we've already committed to a course of action, all of our biases kick in and we're going to believe that thing is true because we put a lot of emotional stake on the fact that it was true when we heard it. And so we were doing this thing that we thought was good. We were doing this thing that we thought was good for us. And we'd rather just keep doing it, right? This is where conservative values come from. This is why conservatives, quite frankly, exist. And I don't have a problem with conservatives. Obviously, I'm on the other side of that fence, and I'm much more progressive. But when I was conservative, this was the core thing, is like, we already know what's good for us, so why are we trying to overcomplicate it? We're making things harder, not simpler. We should just go back to the good thing we already know that we need to do. This is where purity doctrine comes from. This is where just say no to drugs comes from, right? Like, oh, what an easy answer. Just do the good thing, duh. I only agree with good things, so just keep doing the good things, and I disagree with bad things. Okay, but you can't know that unless you know what's true, and if I challenge you on your thinking about whether or not this thing is good or bad for me, and then you get defensive, you're not operating in accordance with your own values. You're not actually trying to find out truth at that point. You are overcommitted to a truth you believed at one time, and that's actually not good for you. If you do that, you will miss out on a higher state of consciousness, more opportunities for higher well-being, and better opportunities to do good in the world. So, the other thing that created the scientific method that a lot of people, aren't too familiar with from the world of philosophy is Cartesian skepticism. So it's a form of being skeptical of something and having a method to that skepticism, right? So Descartes figured this out when he challenged he figured out he had a false belief for something his entire life. Now imagine something you're currently holding super duper sacred right now. Maybe it's a belief in God. Maybe it's a belief in free will. Maybe it's a belief in, a right to life of an infant conceived in the womb, right? And you don't want to change that no matter what. It's too sacred for you. What Descartes figured out is that he had some of those beliefs, and one of them turned out to be wrong. And so if he was so confident in it that he would never change his mind about it, what else could he be wrong about? And so he stripped down everything and started by only accepting the information he knows to be true, then breaking down those truths into smaller units and starting with the simple problems, and then making like complete lists of further problems. Eventually, you get Cartesian skepticism. Becomes really something that creates or kicks off the scientific method. Doubting my findings, trying to find anything that would prove it not to be true before I'm willing to accept that it's the best possible explanation. And if we never had that, I mean, so much of modern science depends on that principle. And maybe there are things that we can't prove all the way, but maybe there are things that, maybe there are things that we can further understand even without science. Even if I can't prove something, maybe there's something I can figure out what's most likely to be true. And that's where we apply a tool like Occam's razor. Essentially it's a problem-solving principle that says if there's more than one theory or explanation, and we can't prove one, the simpler one, the model that requires the fewest parameters, should be preferred. The argument which requires the least amount of assumptions is the one that's most likely to be true. And Occam's razor is incredibly useful for figuring out difficult things. So I use this all the time. And I use this all the time in trying to figure out complex problems, and you can easily apply it to some of today's biggest issues. So now we get to the one that I think is causing. Obviously, there's one that's more fresh in our minds, and it was the school shooting and guns, and we're going to get there. But I think just because it's the one that's raged on more for forever, and I think that you have a more vitriolic discourse around it. Let's talk about abortion first. Let's take abortion. So abortion is an argument that for some people depends on the belief that humans have souls. Okay? Well, I hate to break it to you. There's no evidence for that. There's no good reason. There's no good objective argument that's ever been put forward. It's just really nice to think that we probably do. And it's why it's one of the hardest ones for people to drop. But even if you grant that humans have souls, You can't tell me you know when the soul is created or begins. And again, a large part of the religious argument against abortion is that the soul enters the zygote at the moment of conception, blah, 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 blah. Okay. If I grant you that, you still have all of your work ahead of you, because you have to determine that all souls are persons. Are souls in heaven persons still? Are souls in hell persons? Are souls that are in a brain dead body? Like, where's the soul at? You can't actually make any logical argument based on soul, and you can't do a whole lot of moral work and claim the moral high ground when you can't do anything else with, like, okay, humans have souls, great. You have all your work ahead of you because you have to prove to me when I'm responsible for ending another human soul's life. And if a soul is eternal and goes to heaven anyway, have I really done anything wrong? If anything, I've set it free to go to a better place. You actually have more moral problems if you go with the souls argument, which is why for the longest time I've been telling people wasting a single ounce of breath talking about the abortion debate in any context. And this includes, I'm going to have to break it to my liberal friends, a woman's right to choose? A woman's right to choose what? No one has the right to choose everything. Well, what she does with her own body. Well, again, that's not the argument, because the people on the other side have made a claim that you're choosing to do something to another body, another person, another soul. So it's really annoying to me, actually, that so many liberals, including among them many friends that I'm actually on the same side of this issue on, never stop talking about no man can tell me what to do with my body. Well, no one's doing that. No one's doing that. And you're operating in bad faith, you're being dishonest intellectually, and you're discrediting the opinion on the other side of the argument. What they're saying is you don't have a right to do something to another person's body. You don't have the right to harm another person's body. That's their argument. So every minute that you spend on my body, my choice, you're not getting anywhere closer to solving the problem, because you're completely ignoring and not paying attention to what the person on the other side of this conversation is saying. And that's not fair to them. You're not trying to get at truth at that point. You're just trying to flex and hope that everyone else will back you up, and relying on, mob rule to make your point. You haven't actually made an argument. Your argument falls apart immediately. The whole argument about abortion falls on a topic called personhood, and that is a philosophical problem. There are tons of different arguments as to how we define what the status of a person is. And for us to say that a woman should be able to abort their fetus up until, viability of that fetus outside of the woman, that's when we're saying that thing becomes a person. A legal person then is included in our moral sphere of consideration. Here's the problem. There are like 6 different arguments for personhood, and none of them are particularly satisfying to the majority of people. There are still a lot of people arguing this, and other countries actually have a lot of interesting different rules regarding abortions because of the personhood argument. But it is the one that we need to come up with an answer to and agree on long term. And in the event that we don't solve the problem, we're going to need to go with the best argument on offer right now. My personal favorite argument for personhood and what we grant personhood to, a lot of people don't like, because it means we all have to become vegans. The argument is that anything that can suffer, consciously suffer, feel pain, negative emotions, feel the conscious experience of suffering, is worthy of our moral consideration. The problem is people are big hypocrites. They operate on this way all the time. Even the most avid hunters know that after hunting an animal for food, making it suffer unnecessarily is wrong. We know that there's something deranged about that. I think we operate under that principle more often than not. And the person who makes this argument the best is Peter Singer. And some of his proteges have continued on that line of thinking. He wrote Animal Liberation in the 1960s. And it's a phenomenal book about this very thing, that we should consider conscious feeling animals as persons because they can suffer. We know it's wrong to make people suffer, but okay, maybe we're not willing to call them people. Okay, well then if you're going to eliminate that and say that there's something else that makes personhood, you're going to have to go to one of the, other conceptualizations of personhood. Brain function, cognitive ability. Then you start getting into more philosophical problems because we don't really truly understand how consciousness emerges. You really, really get into the weeds very quickly. But yet, that is the whole thing. The whole fundamental disagreement about abortion comes down to, is that fetus a person? And if not, when does it become one? When do we grant personhood to the unborn child, to the unborn fetus? When does the unborn fetus become an unborn child? Is it always not a person until it's born? And all of that has nothing to do with the soul. Because again, there are souls that are not part of our moral consideration. But even then, you can find human beings in certain attitudes operating as hypocrites based on this, right? You shouldn't desecrate someone's grave. Why not? Doesn't seem to hurt them. They're not around. I'm not hurting anybody. What's actually wrong with doing it? It seems that we're granting some amount of moral consideration to a person who is no longer around to suffer the indignity of that harm. Now, you could argue that desecrating a grave does harm to everyone else that cared about that person, right? You might have an argument there. But if we're the only person whose moral consideration is the soul that's gone on, that you're claiming exists, well, okay, then, clearly we're granting some amount of moral clout to persons that are beyond our world that you have no evidence for and haven't argued for. So it gets all very complicated really quickly, and the fundamental disagreement is personhood. So my challenge to those on the right is, how can you tell anybody else that they're murdering someone when you haven't even defined what a person is? You have no idea. You make claims about souls and supernatural phenomenon like afterlives and heaven, and you have no evidence for it, no arguments for it. We don't know what's true. No one knows, right? And so you're going to tell me I'm a murderer for something that you can't even begin to prove based on that? Or, flip side is, you're not consistent about who you are granting personhood status to. And again, a person is someone worthy of being in our moral community. A person is someone who we're granting moral clout to that we need to consider in our moral attitudes. So the abortion debate's a mess. My friends on the left completely misunderstand the argument from the right and spend a lot of time wasting breath talking about women's bodies and blah, 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 and stuff that's not really where the argument is, because the argument is about, is this thing a person or not? It's very clear to me that if you could prove, if we could argue for, if you had evidence for that fetus is a person, well, then I don't give a damn about a woman's right to choose. You don't have the right to choose to harm another person. And if that's controversial, if you don't think that that's a just verifiable statement, you're wrong. I don't know that we can, again, we don't share common values, and at that point, there's no further conversation. You don't have a right to harm other persons. Now, if you tell me that it's not another person, so I have the right to do whatever I want because it's something that's in my body that's not a person, you're dead on. You're dead on. Couldn't agree more. And that is the position I take. I think that, personhood has to do with, again, when that infant can start to experience suffering. And I'm not sure I agree with the viability outside the womb, but right now that might be the best marker to go with. I think we should be looking into more when we can cause harm and pain to this infant, and when the central nervous system is developed enough for conscious conceptualization of suffering by the infant. But then again, that gets into the weeds of things that we don't really know what we're talking about. So it becomes difficult on that point. And that's my take on the abortion debate. For now, we've got to go with the best thing that we have. And it seems the Supreme Court is content to overturn a really fair and really just ruling based on political motivations and not good reasoned arguments. More or less, this is our first step towards theocracy and the rule of religious-based law. And what is sinister about that? If you need the answer to that, I encourage you to watch A Handmaid's Tale. Anywho, let's move on to the next big topic that I'm going to get canceled over, and guns. Once again, I somewhat get exhausted by my friends on the left, and I typically start these conversations by criticizing the left first, because they deserve it. They operate on their moral high horse way too often and think that they have all the right answers and that they're supremely confident in saying whatever they want. They waste a lot of breath talking about gun control and the right to life, and they say, if you want to talk about right to life of a baby, why don't you care about the right to life to the kids in the school? Once again, this is bad faith. This is completely dismissing people's perspective and what their rights are. This is totally ignoring the real core of the argument. The real core of the argument is on whether or not the state has a right in a particular case to restrict the freedoms of an individual, and when is that restriction appropriate. Essentially, we should be free to do whatever we please, so long as those things that we do don't harm or cause danger to others. This is part of why I think the libertarian position on many topics, it's why I call myself a libertarian socialist. I have the freedom to swing my arm so long as it doesn't hit you or anyone else in the face. However, that's a very simplistic view of freedom. There are positive and negative freedoms. If your freedom to do whatever you want with a firearm and walk around with it strapped to your back open in public is causing a negative impact on my freedom not to be terrified of the human capacity for violence every minute of every day, whose freedom trumps who here? And when can the state intervene? And what are their responsibilities to intervene in this case? Let me first start by saying giving a monopoly on violence over to the state is probably one of the single most important moves in human history. I want you to take that statement in for a moment and understand that if we always left ourselves to resolve conflicts, there are only two paths out of a conflict: conversation or violence. And by the state having the monopoly on violence, running our police, running our military, and having a very orderly, democratically elected system for that's about the smartest thing we've ever done as a species and as a society in our history. And every step towards free and wide open firearms that people seem to think that they can do anything that they want with is a step away from that monopoly on violence. And I think you should take that seriously. If more guns equaled a safer society, this was something that Kyle Kalinske said on his show this past week. If more guns equaled a safer society and less overall murder, we would already be the safest country in the world. We would kill each other the least. We have the most guns, it's not even close. And clearly that does not stop us from killing each other. So all of this time talking about, oh, these other people don't care about human life. Of course they do. Not a single conservative in this country, not even the most staunch pro-gun activists and board members of the NRA are genuinely like, no, I want the kids to die. Like, if you're arguing from that line of thinking and that line of reasoning, you're not only are you wrong, you're wrong in a really harmful way. You're dealing with people on the other side of an important issue in bad faith. And you're discrediting their position. That's not their argument at all. Their argument is that their right to a firearm is as essential as other rights. Now, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole tonight about that particular issue. My wife and I had a conversation about it, and I kind of explained this to her of where this argument really lies. And I'll just say this. I'll tell you my position, and I'll tell you why I have that position. Regarding any other dangerous thing that someone could do that has the potential to kill a lot of other people. Fly a plane, drive a car, mix chemicals, large amounts of them, invent things, use powerful machinery and technology, and any other sense where someone has the potential to do massive amounts of damage to other human beings. We have some demands on them as a society, and no one bats an eye. No one thinks we're violating anyone's rights by having pilot's licenses, right? Like imagine trying to make the same argument that a lot of pro-gun advocates do for why. Hey, listen, planes don't kill people, bad pilots kill people, and it's just bad pilots. That's really the problem. We got to get rid of the bad pilots. We got to stop people from operating planes so badly. Well, I agree. That's why we have a license system. So if you're going to use that argument, then we should have a license system that's equivalent to the pilot's license for guns. Conversation over. Well, but it's in the Constitution, man. Okay, just because something's a right in the Constitution does not make it the be-all, end-all that never gets to get criticized. And if that's how you're operating, once again, now you're dealing with me in bad faith. Because everyone can recognize that the Constitution is just a document written by people that has the capacity to be wrong. Even the people who wrote it did that. That's why it has an amendment process, right? And I'm going to say that if we really want to solve this problem once and for all, the Second Amendment needs to stop being worn like a badge of honor. It's not your right. You don't have the right to do whatever the hell you want. If you want to exercise your right to own a powerful, deadly firearm, you need to prove to me that you're of sound mind, that you have no intents for harm, that you really, really, really know how to use that firearm properly, and that you have never done anything that would suggest that you might be capable of committing real massive harm to other people. And even then, we might be able to say there are certain weapons that there's no good use for, right? There are certain planes that we don't allow to ever hit the sky that have been manufactured in human history because they weren't safe enough to fly. And you're not going to get on that plane. And maybe there are some guns that aren't safe enough to be in circulation. These are weapons of war. And we need to accept those facts. We need to accept those restrictions. It's also frustrating because that is so far away from where the discussion really is. The discussion about guns and violence in America, yes, we have all these guns, it's a problem, but we have some real societal rot. We don't know how to talk about these issues. We don't know how to disagree with respectfully. We don't know how to just be nice to each other and figure out what's true and have a tough conversation. We all want to just bow out every time the going gets tough and say, well, it's my truth, it's my thing, whatever. It's my opinion, walk away. And now we're stuck. And so if you really care about those kids, if you really care about women's rights, if you really care, and I think everyone does. I think everyone on both sides of both of these issues does, because I deal with them in good faith. Well, then the thing that you have to do is stop saying mean shit to each other on Facebook. Stop talking about things that have nothing to do with the actual discussion, and stop going on and on about arguments that have already been debunked, and talk about the actual issue that's dividing us. We are not a theocracy. You don't get to make law with religion. You don't get to tell us what to do because your God says so. We have a system of laws based on reason and evidence and shared values of truth and morality and well-being. And if we can't get that right, then we can't do anything. And as you remember from earlier, how do we figure that out? We have to apply Socratic discourse, arguments, understand more philosophy, treat our currently deeply held beliefs with some skepticism, and be willing to throw them out when they don't work. And that means, to answer the question I posed before this episode, yes, I do think that you have to hold not one single belief as sacred. If you want to actually say that you have a concern for the truth, I hate to break it to you, but you're going to have to be open-minded enough to challenge every single core belief you have, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how that flips your life upside down. If you want to say that you honestly care about those children, if you want to say that you honestly care about women's rights, well, then you better start listening to the other side and be fair to their perspective, and be open to counter arguments and counter evidence to your current position, and not assume that you have some automatic moral high ground. That honestly seems like a great note to end on it. We've got to learn how to talk about tough problems and tough issues without vitriol. We've got to be respectful to each other. We've got to be nice to each other. We got to stop making the enemy, the other person on the other side of the issue, out to be a monster, and treat them as an interlocutor who wants what's good in the world and wants to know what's true. And we've got to be able to have conversations where we can dig at truth. And if we did this more, we would have solved these problems already, because it's fairly obvious what's true in some of these cases. It's just that people don't value this part. They don't understand that they're confused about how we get truth and what truth is. And that's really the hard work that we have to do. So with that, I challenge you. And if you found this particular episode riveting, I encourage you to share it and try to challenge your friends and your family to be more open-minded. Try and challenge those in your life to be more open-minded. You owe it to them to start making the world a better place. That's the only way that we're going to make it better. I really appreciate everybody who came and listened and chatted with me. I hope to do more, but I'm not going to commit to a schedule with as busy as life has been. But this has been fun. It's been glad to be back. I'm glad I had a good topic to talk about tonight. Love you, my beloved audience, and I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day tomorrow, as we remember many people who gave their life over values and what they believe to be true. And I think hopefully after listening to this tonight, maybe you should ask yourself if many of them really should have, if many of them really had to. That's actually the note I want to end it on. I want you to think about what we talked about tonight, and think about if maybe we fought some of the wars that we've fought for the wrong reasons. And maybe we've done so in a way that we let our fellow countrymen die for not very just causes, for the wrong reasons. And I think that's worth thinking about on Memorial Day, because if we don't think about it, we are destined to repeat it over and over again. So once again, thank you. Love y'all. See you next time.